Another thing to be careful of is the selective use of evidence. It can be a temptation to, when you're looking it up in a Greek lexicon or a Greek dictionary, you find something very interesting, and so you ignore any sort of evidence that contradicts your belief. So some people have said that when the Israelites, used the phrase to know, use the verb to know, that they were talking about experiential knowledge, experientially knowing things rather than intellectually knowing things. And then this was carried over into the New Testament because the people that wrote the New Testament were Jews. So when even though they're writing in Greek, they are thinking experiential knowledge. Well, that can be the case with some authors, but there are other words, there are other usages where it is clear that the phrase to know is used to refer to propositional or intellectual content. Right? You know certain things. Right? So sometimes to know means experientially know. I know, all right, and so when it says that we grow in the knowledge of Christ, I think that refers to an experiential knowledge, right? So that we grow to know Christ better experientially. But other times, to know refers to knowing some things, right? Knowing some information. But if we only look at one side of evidence and ignore the rest that could contradict our belief, we have twisted the usage of the words. Other types of fallacies include the either-or fallacy, right? Claiming that a word can only mean one thing or another, it can never be both. Well, there might be some cases where, some things there's an overlap. So, for example, when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, Jesus tells Nicodemus that he has to be born anothen, the Greek word anothen. Well, anothen can mean again, or it could mean from above. So which does it mean? Does it mean again, or does it mean above, from above? Or is it possible that both are kind of connected in there, right? And born again, and metaphorically being born again, but also being born from above. To suggest that it's only one or the other might cause us some issues in other passages where it is clearly one or the other based on the context. But the context in John chapter 3, it could really fit both, which is part of why Nicodemus gets confused, right? Do you have to enter your mother's womb again? What are you trying to say? The end of John chapter 20, when John is relating what the message of the book is, or the purpose of the book, right? When he talks about, there are many other things that Jesus did which are not written in his book, but these were written that you might. Well, is it come to believe, or is it continue to believe? The Greek word there, the verb there, could be translated either way, right? Come to believe or continue to believe. In one case, you are talking about somebody who doesn't have any faith, having faith. Another is somebody that has faith, but this is building them up. Now, it probably means one or the other, but to suggest that that word can only mean that is something that we would have to be very careful about. On the other hand, we might end up restricting the meaning of a word and ignoring that a single word can carry multiple senses in a singular usage. Right? And so a word can have a wide variety of uses. Now, probably in each specific case is going to have a singular sense. But words aren't restricted in that. And that's what I mean by range of meaning. For example, the word bored. The word bored can be a noun, or it can be a verb. When it comes to the word noun, or when it comes to being a noun, it can also have a wide variety of meanings. It could be referring to lumber, right? I went to Home Depot and got a board, right? But it can also refer to food, right? I paid so much for room and board. It can also refer to a group of people, right? I'm going to the Board of Trustees meeting. Right? So the word board can be used in a variety of ways as a noun. It can be used in a variety of ways as a verb, right? The hurricane is coming, so I'm going to board up my windows. And so the sense of protecting or covering, right? Or, it's time for me to board the train. Right? So I have to get on the train, or I have to get on the plane. Right? And so all of these, it's one English word, but it carries a wide variety of meanings or senses depending on the usage. And of course, in any of those, there's no root meaning. Right? What would be the root meaning? You can use it for lumber, you can use it for a group of people, you can use it for food. Another danger is to ignore that different authors can use the same word in different ways. Or they might have nuances of meaning that wouldn't necessarily be found in other authors. So they might be using the same word, but using it in a slightly different way. And so it's just because Paul uses a word in a particular way and has certain senses within it, like righteousness, or grace, or something like that, right? Well, Paul can use that word in one way, and Peter might use it slightly differently, for example. And so we have to be careful in talking about those things. There might be something that's emphasized by one author that's not emphasized by another. And then finally, we have to be careful of the arguments that you will find in scholarly commentaries, articles, related to arguments based on the tense or the mood. Right? Well, this is in aorist tense, or this is in the imperative mood. Right? And so sometimes people will make an argument of, well, it's because it's in the aorist tense, this means X. Well, tenses and moods can function in a variety of ways, so there's often not a real use of the tense or the mood where people can say, because it's in such and such tense, it means X. Well, it might, but it might not, right? Because a particular tense might have a wide variety of uses. So we have to be careful on how we use any sort of word study, or if we're trying to study a specific passage, for example, and come across a word and look it up as part of exegesis or something like that. We have to be careful in how we approach those things, because there are a wide variety of ways that we can twist the work that's been done. Additionally, there are ways in which you can approach word studies in different ways. You could engage in word studies in English. Now, if you're going to engage in a word study in English, you should be careful in how you do that, because an English word might carry some meanings that might not necessarily be represented by the Greek word it translates. And so just because you can pull out a variety of things to say about the English, doesn't mean necessarily that it's in the Greek. But you could, do a word study of how Paul uses faith in 1 Corinthians or Ephesians or something like that. And so you could do some things. You just have to be careful in how you're approaching it. You could certainly, approach it from the standpoint of the original language. So I want to see how, kind of the same way instead of in the Greek. How does Paul use pistis, which is often translated faith? How does Paul use pistis in 1 Corinthians or Ephesians or something like that? Word studies might also be useful if you're thinking about a specific aspect of theology. Right? You're doing a systematic theology of faith, for example. Right? And so talking about the various ways that faith is used, but more from a theological standpoint. You might also pay attention, thinking about word studies, pay attention to the rhetorical style or choices that an author makes in developing an argument. And certainly depending on the author, it's going to be different based on, God, yes, God, I believe in inspiration, but God uses the rhetorical abilities and strengths and those kind of aspects of these specific authors so that, you can tell the difference between the Greek of Paul and the Greek of John, or the Greek of Luke and the Greek of John might be a better example. John has a very simplistic approach to Greek, where Luke's is much more educated. There's a difference between the rhetorical, laying out of an argument in certain places. And one example of a rather intricate use of this is found in the book of Hebrews. And I'll just give you an example of this, where rhetorical studies could be a useful thing in approaching it. So, for example, this is from Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. No one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. And although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. All right, so just a brief section of Hebrews. But as scholars have noted, this is a very interesting structure of Hebrews, argument known as the chiasmus. The chiasmus comes from the idea of the Greek letter chi, and specifically that it kind of narrows into the center and then expands back out, right? The X. And that essentially the argument that the Hebrews writer is making here functions in that same way. So he starts off first by noting, right, that every priest is appointed to an order of service. The priest can deal gently with the people, right? This is a very simplistic form of what we just read. The priest must be called by God. And so he's making these 3 points, and then now he's going to go backward. Jesus was called by God. Jesus can deal gently with the people, and Jesus was appointed to the order of Melchizedek. All right? And so in building his argument, he has essentially kind of made this, you can kind of see it, right, with kind of X type of shape if you would plot it out. Right? And so it's a rhetorical style. Right? And so by looking at the words and thinking about how the words function together, you're able to notice how this argument is built and developed. Now again, the Hebrews writer there's much more that the Hebrews writer does than in some other arguments or some other books. And certainly some styles of books lend itself more to this than others. Right? You're going to find more about rhetorical choices and thinking about rhetorical choices in the epistles than you're necessarily going to find in the Gospels, right? And so you can certainly do a rhetorical analysis of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, but the Gospels themselves aren't as rhetorically focused as something like the letter to the Hebrews would be, because that is trying to make a specific argument. So if you decide you're going to do a word study, or you come across a word in your study and you want to examine it more intricately, what is out there to help you investigate? Well, there are a variety of tools that can be used for this, and there are some differences as to how these tools are used. there are dictionaries that are available, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Concordances is another tool that would be useful in word studies. Lexicons, and then finally, lexical aids. In general, these are the types of works that are going to be most useful to you when you are engaging in a word study. Now, dictionaries, of course, we talked about last Wednesday, so we're not really going to talk about a dictionary again because we know what they are. I'm going to give you a couple of different sources or different word study tools that could be useful. When it comes to the Old Testament, there are a couple that could be useful to you. The first might be the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. It's 2 volumes made up of 40 different scholars over every Hebrew word of theological significance. And so it's not every word, but the major ones. This one tends to be focused more specifically on ministers or people that are serious about study but may not necessarily have the Hebrew language background. Right? So, obviously probably most of you haven't had too much Hebrew, if at all, and so it's probably not going to be looking for the scholarly things, but this might be a source that would be useful if you were doing something in the Old Testament. Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament could be useful. This is probably geared more towards somebody who has some facility with the Hebrew language, especially at least the Hebrew alphabet, because it is in alphabetical order from the Hebrew. A good work because it focuses not just on the Old Testament words, but thinks about the ancient Near East background. What are words in other languages that are similar? What are the theological content of Hebrew, the Hebrew and the Aramaic, right? So not just Hebrew, but Aramaic as well. And then finally, the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis could be helpful. It focuses again on Hebrew words and related meanings, but is in Hebrew alphabetical order. So you have to have some facility with both the Hebrew language, knowing what's the alphabetical order in Hebrew, being able to look up words in Hebrew. And so, this is probably more for that. But could be very useful because of, its discussion of a wide variety of topics, as well as in the first volume, there's a guide to Old Testament theology and exegesis, which could be useful even if you don't use the rest of the dictionary for learning a specific Hebrew word. When it comes to the New Testament, there's some very similar sources. First of all, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It actually came out first, and so the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament was kind of patterned on it. Here too, the words are arranged in Greek alphabetical order, so you have to know what Greek word you're looking for, and you have to know the Greek alphabet. But there's a lot of discussion. It's not just the usage in the New Testament, but how these words would be used in the Septuagint, right? That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. How it would be used in the intertestamental literature. There's a section of books that are found in the Septuagint and the Old Testaments of groups like Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, books like the Book of Tobit, Judith, some other books, the Maccabees. Right? Some books that were written in that period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, written in Greek, so there's some discussion there. Also discussions of words as they're used by early Christians, etc. People have questioned the methodology of this dictionary, so you have to be careful with it. because often they fell into some of the root fallacies, right? That the word has a meaning that is used every time the word is used, right? And so you have to be careful about that. But it can be useful in this the survey of how it was been used in various types of literature. Another helpful work might be the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament, giving you definitions of every Greek word in the New Testament, transliterating it for you, right? So if you're writing a paper, you can know how to put it in English. Giving you declension information, what type of declension is this, giving the gender, etc. As well as talking about the context in which the word is found. Right, and so helping you think about, all right, this word in this context, what exegetical significance might there be? And then finally, the New International Dictionary of the New Testament Theology and Exegesis. Again, the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology was originally published, and then the Old Testament one was, adding that part of and exegesis. When it was first published, it was a source of information for ministers and teachers, people interested in teaching the Bible, that arranged words in alphabetical order, and so it was more geared for a general audience rather than someone that necessarily knew Greek, and so you didn't have to have a great knowledge of Greek or Hebrew, even though there was that discussion. In 2014, it was redone, or it was published in 2014, done by a linguist. So a lot of the things, the fallacies, some of the fallacies we talked about showed up in some of the articles. But the new version still contains a lot of the positive things, but is also shaped by some things from lexicography. So it's been recently revised. Any questions about dictionaries?